John Lennon wasn't exactly known for handing out compliments, especially when it came to his Beatles bandmates, but there was one George Harrison song that stopped him in his tracks. A track so powerful, so emotionally rich, that Lennon openly called it his favorite. The real shock? It wasn't even a chart topper. Discover the hidden gem that earned Lennon's rare praise, and why he believed it captured something he never could. This isn't just about music, it's about legacy. By the time 1969 rolled around, the Beatles were no longer the tight-knit group that had taken over the world just a few years earlier. The magic that had once defined their friendship and creative process was starting to fall apart. What used to be fun studio sessions filled with laughter and experimentation had now become cold, tense, and filled with long silences. Arguments weren't rare anymore. They were the norm. The four men who had changed music forever were drifting apart, and everyone could feel it. It wasn't just about music. It was everything. Money, power, fame, control. The band had taken on new business ventures, especially with the formation of Apple Corps, their creative company. But instead of bringing them together, it created more problems. Financial disagreements kept popping up, and the search for a proper business manager only made things worse. Paul McCartney backed one person, the others wanted someone else. Every decision seemed to spark a new fight. And then there were the personal differences. John Lennon had fallen deeply in love with Yoko Ono, and he wanted her by his side constantly, even in the studio. This didn't sit well with the others, especially Paul. It wasn't that they disliked Yoko as a person, they just weren't used to having outsiders involved in their very personal and private creative space. To them, the Beatles were sacred. To John, his relationship with Yoko had become just as important. George Harrison, meanwhile, had been quietly growing frustrated for years. He had always been seen as the quiet Beatle, and his songwriting had often taken a back seat to Lennon and McCartney's work. But by 1969, George had matured as a songwriter. He had songs he believed in, beautiful, emotional, meaningful pieces, and he was tired of them being dismissed or overlooked. Every time he brought something to the table, it felt like it was brushed aside. The tension was growing inside him, but he didn't explode. He waited, observed, and prepared. Even Ringo Starr, usually the peacekeeper, felt the strain. He had briefly quit the band in 1968 during the White Album sessions because he felt unappreciated and left out. Though he came back, the mood in the group never fully recovered. Everyone was walking on eggshells, trying not to set each other off. But it was clear that the brotherhood they once had was barely hanging on. Inside the studio, things were awkward. Instead of playing together as a unit, the members often recorded their parts separately. They would come in at different times of day, sometimes even on different days, just to avoid each other. Collaboration became more of a formality than a joy. The spark that had once fueled their legendary albums, like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, was fading fast. The documentary footage from the Let It Be sessions, filmed in early 1969, would later show just how strained things had become. The band looked tired, their conversations were stiff, their smiles were forced, and in one moment that's now iconic, George and Paul bickered over guitar parts. It wasn't explosive, but it was uncomfortable. Two people who used to finish each other's musical sentences, now struggling to find common ground. Despite all this, they still had moments of brilliance. The music, even during this period of chaos, was incredible. Songs like Come Together, Here Comes the Sun, and Something were created during this time. But it was clear that these were the works of individuals, not a group. The Beatles had become four solo artists, temporarily sharing a name. And as tensions mounted, the band started looking beyond the Beatles. John was diving into his work with Yoko and planning a solo future. Paul was growing anxious, trying to keep things together but knowing it couldn't last. George was gathering songs for what would become his iconic solo album, All Things Must Pass. Everyone was slowly, quietly, preparing to move on. In a way, Abbey Road became their unspoken farewell. They didn't talk about it openly, but deep down, each of them probably knew this was the end. They gave it one last push. One last album to remind the world of what they were capable of, even as they stood on the edge of collapse. By the end of 1969, the Beatles were still together in name, but the heart of the band was gone. The unity, the brotherhood, the sense of us against the world, it had all been worn down by years of pressure. What had started as four boys chasing a dream had become four men trying to find a way out. The final chapter had begun, and there was no turning back. George Harrison had always been seen as the quiet Beatle, while John Lennon and Paul McCartney soaked up the spotlight with their explosive creativity and constant media attention. George often stood a few steps back. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he was watching, learning, and slowly building a voice of his own. And in 1969, that voice finally demanded to be heard, through a song that would change everything, something. By this point, the Beatles were already falling apart. The magic that once connected them had turned into ego battles, business fights, and personal drama. Recording sessions felt more like negotiations than jam sessions. Yet, right in the middle of all that noise, George showed up with a song that made everyone in the room stop and pay attention. Something wasn't loud or rebellious. It didn't try to prove anything through force. It was gentle, elegant, and incredibly sincere. But beneath that calm surface was a quiet revolution. George had spent years trying to get his songs taken seriously, often contributing only 1 or 2 tracks per album, and even those were sometimes brushed aside. Lennon and McCartney ran the show, and George knew it. But something wasn't going to be ignored. Not this time. He introduced the song during the Abbey Road sessions with quiet confidence. He had worked on it carefully, shaping every note in his mind before bringing it to the band. And when he played it, even John Lennon, usually quick to criticize, had nothing but praise. That was rare. Lennon didn't give compliments lightly, especially to George. But this time, he couldn't deny the song's brilliance. He called it the best track on the album. In the studio, George took full control of the arrangement. He knew exactly how he wanted it to sound. He worked closely with Paul McCartney to develop that now comic bass line, and he was clear about the vibe he was going for. Lennon, interestingly, took a back seat, adding subtle piano parts and staying mostly out of the way. That was also unusual. It was a sign of respect, acknowledgement that this was George's moment. Producer George Martin helped add the final touch, a string arrangement that elevated something into something timeless. Normally, Lennon would have objected to that kind of polish. He liked things raw and unfiltered. But not this time. Nobody got in George's way. And the result? One of the most beautiful love songs ever written. When Abbey Road was released, something didn't just stand out. It soared. It became the first Harrison penned track to be featured as a Beatles A-side single, paired with Lennon's Come Together. It was a big deal. Harrison had officially joined the songwriting elite, and the world noticed. Critics loved it. Musicians covered it. Frank Sinatra famously called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. For a guy who'd been underestimated for most of his career, that kind of praise was life-changing. But this moment wasn't just about one song. It was about everything that led up to it. George had quietly been growing for years, experimenting with Indian music, diving deep into spirituality, and writing songs that were more introspective and soulful than many of his bandmates. He wasn't trying to compete with Lennon or McCartney. He was just trying to be heard. And something finally made that happen. Of course, the success of the song came with its own set of complications. McCartney, while supportive, couldn't ignore the fact that George had just written something that rivaled his own best work. The quiet Beatle had stepped into the spotlight, and the balance inside the band shifted, if only slightly. Lennon praised it, but it didn't heal the rift. It was more like a brief moment of harmony before everything collapsed for good. For George, the song was proof that he didn't need to fight for scraps anymore. He had the talent, the vision, and the confidence to stand on his own. And even though the Beatles wouldn't last much longer, something showed the world what George Harrison was capable of. It wasn't just a great song. It was a declaration. A quiet one, sure, but one that shook the foundations of the greatest band in the world. Looking back, something feels like a bittersweet victory. It marked the moment when George was finally taken seriously, but also the moment when the band's end became impossible to ignore. Still, in that one song, George captured a kind of magic that few musicians ever reach, and in doing so, he rewrote his own legacy. By the time the Beatles were recording Abbey Road in 1969, things were falling apart. They weren't the same tight-knit group that had burst onto the scene in the early 60s. The energy had changed. Tension filled the studio. Paul McCartney had taken over as a kind of unofficial leader, and John Lennon was increasingly distant, both musically and emotionally. Ringo Starr had already quit the band once, And George Harrison, the so-called quiet Beatle, was quietly growing into a force none of them had quite expected. George had always been in the shadows, overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting powerhouse. He'd get 1 or 2 songs per album, sometimes even those were dismissed or altered. But he never stopped writing. He kept working, kept learning, and slowly developed a style that was deep, reflective, and musically rich. When he brought something to the Abbey Road sessions, it wasn't just another George song. It was a moment that made the entire band stop and take notice. John Lennon, known for being blunt and not easily impressed, actually complimented the song. That alone says a lot. Lennon rarely praised others' work, especially within the band, where egos often clashed. But he called something the best track on Abbey Road. That wasn't just a compliment, it was a moment of real respect. It meant George had written something that even John, with all his confidence and sharp edges, couldn't ignore. Inside the studio, that respect began to shift the usual dynamic. George wasn't looking for validation anymore. He walked into the session with a clear vision. He knew what he wanted from the song, how it should sound, how the guitar should flow, where the strings should rise. He wasn't asking for permission. He was taking ownership. Paul, usually the one who drove arrangements, followed George's lead this time. Even John kept his distance and played a minor role, something unthinkable just a few years earlier. And it wasn't just the song. It was the way George carried himself, calm, focused, confident. While the others were dealing with legal battles, side projects, and personal fallouts, George was focused on the music. And that showed. It felt like the balance of power inside the Beatles was shifting, not loudly, but steadily. For once, George wasn't the junior partner. He was the artist at the center of it all. Producer George Martin helped add the orchestral touches George wanted. Normally, that kind of production might have caused tension. John, for example, often hated anything that felt too polished. But here, no one objected. Everyone let George have his moment. Because it was clear he had created something special, there was no argument to be had. When something was released, it wasn't just a fan favorite. It became the first Harrison song to be released as an A-side of a Beatles single, paired with Lennon's Come Together. That was historic. It said George wasn't just tagging along anymore. He was standing alongside the band's strongest songwriters. And the public agreed. The song topped charts, drew praise from critics, and was soon covered by dozens of artists, including Frank Sinatra, who famously called it one of the greatest love songs ever written. The Quiet Beatle had just made the loudest statement of his life. That moment of respect George got from John wasn't just about musical taste. It was about finally being seen, really seen, as an equal. It was a rare glimpse of acknowledgement that had been missing for years. But it came at a strange time, because while George was finally stepping into his power, the band around him was crumbling. John was more interested in working with Yoko and exploring avant-garde art. Paul was frustrated and trying to hold things together. Ringo just wanted peace. And George? He was beginning to realize that maybe he didn't need the Beatles to make great music. Maybe he never had. Something wasn't just a success, it was a sign of what was possible outside the Beatles. After Abbey Road, the group never really came back together creatively. Let It Be, though released later, was mostly finished before Abbey Road. And with that, the Beatles era ended. But the spark George ignited with Something carried into his solo career, where he would continue to grow as a songwriter and artist. He had more to say, and now, finally, people were ready to listen. Looking back, the shift was clear. In a band where power had always been split between John and Paul, George stepped in and quietly changed the narrative. Not with fights or press statements, but with a single, beautiful song. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A moment of respect, a shift in power, and a quiet voice finally heard. When George Harrison wrote Something, he probably had no idea how much it would come to represent. Not just for himself as a songwriter, but for the Beatles as a whole. By the time the band was deep into the Abbey Road sessions, things between the four of them were tense, even broken. What had once been the most influential and unstoppable group in music history was now struggling to stay in the same room. Arguments were common, trust was fading, and the end felt near. But right in the middle of all that noise, George quietly delivered a song that would outlive the band itself. Something wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't scream for attention. But that's what made it so powerful. It was soft, beautiful, and full of emotion. It was simple, but in the most elegant way possible. And more importantly, it came from George, the band member who had spent most of the Beatles' career overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney duo. For years, George's songs were limited to 1 or 2 per album. His ideas were often pushed aside. He had talent, clearly, but rarely the chance to show just how deep it ran. Until now. The band was falling apart, but something gave everyone pause. Even John Lennon, who could be cold and brutally honest, admitted that it was the best track on the album. Coming from John, that meant a lot. He didn't hand out compliments easily, and he didn't often acknowledge George's songwriting. But this song, this one, couldn't be ignored. It cut through the chaos in the studio and reminded them all what made the Beatles special in the first place. Real emotion, real music, and timeless honesty. Recording Something wasn't like recording other Beatles songs. George was in control. He came in with a clear vision and wasn't afraid to speak up. Paul McCartney, despite often being the one to take over sessions, played a beautiful bass line that flowed perfectly with George's melody. John stayed in the background, adding piano but not trying to dominate. That kind of studio balance was rare at that point in their career, which just goes to show how much respect this song demanded, even unspoken. George also wanted strings, something lush, something cinematic. With producer George Martin's help, he got exactly that. The arrangement gave the song its emotional lift without overdoing it. And what's even more telling is that no one fought him on it. Usually, John would have pushed back on anything too polished, but not this time. He knew better. Everyone did. When Something was released, it wasn't just another track buried on the album. It was chosen as a single, the single, and it was paired with Come Together, one of John's most iconic songs. This was history. For the first time ever, a George Harrison song was standing side by side with Lennon-McCartney work on the same footing. That was a huge deal. After years of playing catch-up, George had arrived, and in many ways, he'd surpassed expectations. Critics and fans alike were blown away. The song was instantly praised as one of the best love songs ever written, and they weren't the only ones who noticed. Big-name artists from all over the world began covering it. Frank Sinatra famously called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years, even though he mistakenly credited it to Lennon and McCartney at first. Still, the praise stuck, and the song became part of the cultural fabric. But what makes Something truly special isn't just the sound or the success. It's what it came to represent. By the time it reached listeners' ears, the Beatles were already falling apart. The chemistry that once fueled them had burned out. So, in a way, Something felt like the last pure moment. The last time it felt like magic again. It was both a peak and a goodbye. George had finally gotten his spotlight, but the band around him was fading into the past. After the Beatles officially split, Something didn't disappear with them. If anything, it grew. George continued to play it throughout his solo career. He even performed it with different arrangements, showing how timeless and flexible the song really was. Each performance carried a different weight, sometimes joy, sometimes nostalgia, sometimes sadness. But it always connected, it was personal, and people felt that. Years later, after George passed away, Paul McCartney began performing Something during his concerts as a tribute to his friend. He would start it on the ukulele, George's favorite instrument, before the full band joined in. Those moments were emotional, raw, and respectful. It wasn't about the Beatles anymore. It was about George. It was about love and memory and friendship. Paul didn't need to say anything. The music said it all. That's the thing about a song like Something. It doesn't belong to one moment or one era. It doesn't feel dated. You can play it today and it still hits. It's been played at weddings, funerals, in movies, and on radio stations around the world. It speaks a language that goes beyond generations, and that's rare. Very few songs carry that kind of weight and softness at the same time. It also tells a quiet story. The story of someone who was underestimated for too long. George had talent, heart, and vision. He just needed the space to be heard. And when he got it, he gave the world one of the most beautiful love songs ever written. Something is his legacy. It's his reminder that brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And that whisper can echo forever. Even within the Beatles' discography, Something stands out. Yes, there are songs with more energy, more political weight, more experimentation, but few have the emotional depth and staying power that Something holds. It's the kind of song that doesn't just belong to the Beatles. It belongs to anyone who's ever been in love, ever felt overwhelmed by emotion, or ever had to let someone go. Looking back, it's almost poetic. The Beatles began with Lennon and McCartney defining the sound of a generation. But they ended with George Harrison reminding the world what true vulnerability sounds like. Something wasn't just a great Beatles song. It was one of the best songs any of them ever wrote. So when people say that the Beatles ended on a high note, they're right. But that high note belonged to George, and while the band might be a thing of the past, that song? It's still playing, still loved, still living, and it probably always will be.